In this video, we are talking about a remarkable opera singer. She was one of the first internationally recognized Black opera singers. Known as the Black Swan, she defied racial barriers to perform for audiences across the U.S. and Europe. Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield was born into slavery around 1817 in Natchez, Mississippi. According to an 1854 article in the Tri-Weekly Commercial, her mother was of Indian descent and her father was an African. As a child, she was taken to Philadelphia by her enslaver, Mrs. Holliday Greenfield, who was a Quaker. Elizabeth lived with Mrs. Greenfield until she was about 8 years old. Then she attended Clarkson School, a private Quaker school. She studied music as a child, encouraged by Mrs. Greenfield. Although musical education was not generally provided by the Quakers with whom she associated. She returned to live with Mrs. Greenfield in 1836 to take care of her. Mrs. Greenfield died in 1845. Elizabeth was to receive a large sum of money from Mrs. Greenfield, valuable estate, but legal complications kept the money in limbo for many years. In the meantime, Elizabeth, now in her mid-20s, began teaching music to earn a living as a single Black woman in Philadelphia. The Quakers opposed slavery, and upon Mrs. Greenfield's death, Elizabeth was freed. Due to being left without financial support, Elizabeth had to work as a domestic servant to survive. Unlike most opera singers of her time, Elizabeth had no formal European training. Instead, she developed her voice through self-teaching and listening to others. She discovered her talent for singing and eventually began performing in private settings. She had an extraordinary vocal range, spanning 3 octaves, with the ability to sing both soprano and deep contralto parts. Despite having no classical training, her natural ability amazed audiences. She was mentored by a few musicians and patrons who encouraged her career. In about 1851, Elizabeth began to sing at private parties, debuting at the Buffalo Musical Association under the patronage of Electa and Herman B. Potter. Later that year, in 1851, she announced the performance in Buffalo. Some white concertgoers threatened to boycott the venue. However, abolitionist supporters encouraged her to perform, and the concert was a success, marking the beginning of her professional career. Despite these challenges, Elizabeth gained a wide following among abolitionists and music lovers, and her fame grew. Some music critics wrote racist reviews claiming it was unnatural for a Black woman to have such vocal ability. Elizabeth's first major promoter was Colonel Joseph H. Wood, a P.T. Barnum-type promoter and supporter of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which would not allow Black patrons into her concerts. Wood saw Elizabeth as a way to profit from her talent, but he marketed her in many ways that reinforced racist stereotypes. He used the nickname the Black Swan, which was a contrast to the famous white opera singer Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, drawing attention to her race rather than her talent. Wood took financial control of Elizabeth's concerts, and she didn't receive compensation for many of her performances. He kept her in a state of isolation. On March 31st, 1853, Elizabeth debuted at Metropolitan Hall in New York City, which held an audience of 4,000. Before the concert, there were rumors that there would be white supremacist riots and the threat of arson. Even at the concert, Elizabeth experienced racism, with the audience laughing as she took the stage, escort on the stage keeping his distance. Following the concert, Elizabeth was highly criticized, and it just breaks my heart that this talented woman had to endure such vile ignorance. After the concert, Elizabeth apologized to her black performers for their exclusion from the performance and gave a concert to benefit the home of aged colored persons and the Colored Orphan Asylum. And it just reminds me of the story of Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who was King George III's wife. It was rumored that Queen Charlotte came from black Portuguese nobility, and so there's a infamous portrait of her where she looks like she's of mixed ancestry. And I read a story where Queen Charlotte came over on a boat to marry King George, and they actually married the same day. Well, I believe after the marriage there was like a parade or something of that nature, and it was said that the British public was not very kind to her and that she was heckled a lot. Elizabeth performed at Exeter Hall, a major venue in London, before an audience of over 1,000 people. Despite her European success, American opera houses and classical music institutions did not accept her as an equal to white singers. Unlike white opera singers who were supported by wealthy patrons, Elizabeth had to rely on abolitionists and the black community leaders for sponsorship. She was never given an opportunity to perform in a major American opera house during her lifetime. She gave a command performance for Queen Victoria at Buckingham Palace on May 10, 1854. She was the first black American performer to perform before British royalty. Queen Victoria paid her £20 and passage for her return to the United States. After returning to the U.S., Elizabeth continued to perform, but also became a vocal coach for young black singers. She founded a music studio in Philadelphia, where she trained future generations of black American musicians. Elizabeth died in Philadelphia of paralysis on March 31st, 1876. Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield's story is one of extraordinary perseverance. She broke racial barriers in classical music at a time when few black musicians could even dream of a professional career. Though she did not receive the same recognition as white opera singers in her lifetime, she paved the way for later black opera stars like Marian Anderson and Leontine Price. Here's an excerpt from Judy Ann Hargrove's YouTube channel. The link is in the description box at the bottom of the video. And here's a rendition of Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield singing, and I'm not sure if it's a song of Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, but it's a rendition of how more than likely Elizabeth sound in regards to how she sang during her time. Enjoy.
See what the